Hello and welcome along to the Redaction Reports and Weekly News Roundup. I am your host, Richard Hansen, for this week, and I'm joined by my co-host, Declan Carey. How are you today?
Yeah, good. Thanks, mate. How you doing?
Oh yeah, I'm not too bad. It's been a bit of a can't say it's been a slow week in news. The first business week back in September tends to bring a few things. So we've got plenty of things that we're going to be wanting to talk about today. I think probably the most pressing issue, probably on the forefront of everybody's mind, is the national insurance hike. So what do you make of it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to say about this. Obviously, we heard that there's going to be a 1.25% increase in order to raise around £36 billion, primarily to be used for social care. This is because of obviously the backlog for the NHS and the higher demand and the pressure that COVID's put on the system. There's a couple of things to say about it, really. It is going to affect people unfairly. That's been some of the comments that have come out around this. So, just to give an example on that, low earners, a bigger portion of their salary is going to be gone towards that than people who earn higher amounts. So therefore, a lot of people are saying it's not entirely fair way to fund the system. It's kind of like a tax on earnings as well. So it's money that you earn from your labor, from your work. That's where it's coming out of. So if you're, for example, a landlord who owns several properties and your entire income comes from your rent, you're not going to pay any more towards that. But someone who is, say a person working at a supermarket who is on a low salary, you're actually going to pay quite a significant portion of your salary towards that. And this is social care, which you probably don't really need to use right now. It's probably going to be for people who are quite a bit older, who need to rely on that kind of care. So, yeah, there's been lots of comments about how unfair it's been, and I think I can understand some of those. Have you seen similar reactions?
Yeah, I've seen pretty much just echo the sentiment that you've said. I mean, one interesting thing to start with is that, you mentioned it's a 1.25% rise. It's 1.25 percentage points,
Yeah.
which obviously I'm sure you know, but is actually a 10% rise in real terms. If you think you're going to go from 12% to 13.25%, which, yeah, in real terms is a 10% hike. And I think from a journalistic standpoint, I think a lot of that was missed. I think it's important to be kind of truthful to readers and listeners, and to get people to understand exactly how much more this is going to be costing working people. And yeah, it's going to adversely affect younger people, poorer people, and workers. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Conservative Party tended to be saying we want to get as many people into work as we can, but you can see they're protecting their voter base. Older people who might own multiple properties and things are going to be voting for them, but perhaps these people that are going to be penalised may not have been voting for them at all. But if you look at, there've been a couple of interesting opinion polls in the last few days. The latest YouGov poll, I think, saw Labour ahead by 2.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, and there was a poll out last night. I don't have off the top of my head who it was by, but it had them equal at 38 and 38. So it goes to show, doesn't it? 100,000+ COVID deaths and gross mismanagement and incompetence in handling a global pandemic, in my opinion, tends to really not move the needle much. But increase people's taxes, well, no, we won't be doing that.
I mean, that's where it hurts, doesn't it? And people are going to feel that. It's interesting because I want to just look at the other side of it as well. The publication which I write for on a daily basis, we obviously published an article about this, and it was really interesting to see that in a lot of the comments, there were quite a lot of people who were really trying to understand the increase and almost sympathise with it. And I think that is kind of playing into the government's hands a little bit, because I think people do realise that, when there is higher public spending, as there was obviously during the pandemic to fund these essential services and the overload that was on the NHS, people do understand that money's got to come from somewhere. That money has to be paid. So I do think, although there is criticism of it, and I think it's justified, I do think some people are sympathetic towards that. Some people are saying, well, I'm going to pay a little bit more. It doesn't affect me too much. But yeah, coming back to what we were saying, it's going to be those people who are really on the lowest salaries, the people who are really sort of even you think about even people who are in work poverty, so they maybe have a job, but they still go to food banks. You think of people like with disabilities who have naturally high costs anyway.
You combine that with the fact that the universal credit uplift is about to finish as well. So it's a double whammy for these people. Absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder if I was a voter in Hartlepool who'd voted Conservative, I wonder how I'd feel about that right now.
Yeah, I do agree. And it looks as if that's the kind of that is the kind of voter that may have deserted the Conservatives if you're looking at the current opinion polling. But then that does remain to be seen, though, because the voters seem to be split along home ownership lines now. Whether you're an owner or you're a renter. Somebody who works a gig economy job, 2 different 0 hours contracts and pays extortionate rent, but lives in, I don't know, North London and is in their 20s, is arguably more working class than somebody who owns their own home worth $250,000 pounds. God, apologies for £250,000 and lives in one of these northern red wall seats. So we might be seeing a bit more of a fundamental realignment of that. But yeah, I think we're going to be talking about this a bit more before long. So yeah, interesting.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So if we move on slightly, there's obviously another piece of news which has been dominating the headlines internationally, and it's these new abortion laws that Texas have brought in the United States. So I think from memory, the governor Greg Abbott has said that any abortion or termination after 6 weeks is not legal, will not be allowed, and the US Supreme Court upheld, well, not so much upheld the decision, but refused to hear the decision. So I think, before we start talking about this, I think it's probably important that here we are, 2 male, white, middle-class men chatting about this kind of subject. I think we probably need to check our privilege slightly, and suggest that, it would be having a woman in this conversation, or this conversation being done by women, would probably be much more appropriate. But be that as it may, what do you make of it, Declan?
Yeah, it's right to recognise that, I think, first of all, and just in terms of my own thoughts about it, it's obviously deeply unfair on women in Texas, because it's gonna, I mean, obviously the law that you talked about, the abortion law, so yeah, it's around the 6-week mark, with activity on the heart, basically. That's how they judge it. The way I see it, I mean, it's just going to lead to, it's not going to stop abortions from happening. It's just going to lead to women going to, unsafe ways to get them, because at the end of the day, it's such a huge decision that's going to affect your life to have a baby or not. So it's gonna, we're gonna, I think we could end up seeing people dying because of this. We're going to see people getting seriously hurt. And what's really bizarre is just the kind of bounty style kind of system which they've now brought out, in terms of how people can now easily take abortion providers to court in the US. There's a sort of a cash amount that they can collect if they find people and take them to court and win that case. And it's so, I was reading about it today, doing my research about it, and it's so kind of like unfairly balanced even in the court system as well, in the fact that if you do take someone to court and you lose and you use that claim, you then don't have to pay the defendant's legal costs. So it's just so unfairly skewed the way it's come out, obviously by the Republican governor, Greg Abbott, who you mentioned in Texas. And yeah, I just can't see how anything good is going to come from this. What do you think about it?
Well, I think a few things. I think in this, we are kind of seeing the lasting legacy of the Trump presidency. I mean, we all know that, Trump himself was far from a, conservative evangelical Christian. But the way that he courted that vote in 2016 and 2020 was to promise to put conservative justices on the Supreme Court. He was lucky enough, for one reason or another, to have 3 opportunities to do that, and he managed to stack. Now he's stacked the court 6-3 in a conservative direction. And obviously, these justices are appointed for life. Obviously, some of them retire before they die, but some die when they're on the bench. So this this could be a sign of things to come. I think a few other things. I think there is a bit of a gross misunderstanding by the Texas governor about certain aspects. He was questioned a week or so ago about exceptions for rape and also for incest, and he reminded the person who he was questioned by that, well, no, he has the woman has 6 weeks to make this decision, and obviously that's not true. Someone who is 6 weeks pregnant is 2 weeks late on the period. So that can happen for any number of reasons that may not have anything even to do with pregnancy. So, I mean, if you're approaching it from that kind of standpoint, it really does make me worry for the future. And like you said, it's certainly not going to stop abortions from happening. It's going to adversely affect people of color. It's going to affect people with less money. Obviously, you're going to need in order to get an abortion. One of the options for Texans now is going to be to travel to another state. Yeah. But obviously, that's not free and that's not accessible to everybody. So there are only downsides to this, and it's a real disappointment. And I know that there are several other states who are really trying to do the same sort of thing. So now that this has been upheld, I think that it's only going to embolden them further to do more of this, and we're going to see, if not the overturning of Roe versus Wade, we're certainly going to see a serious scale back in abortions in the United States. So yeah.
I mean, I think it's worth pointing out as well. I was just reading about it today that the Biden administration is challenging this, so that they are going to try and challenge it and change it for what it is. We'll see what comes of that. I mean, I don't know what powers exactly they have to do that, but we'll see what comes of it. It's going to be interesting to see that kind of state versus federal government kind of knocking heads almost on this issue. And I wonder if we'll see a little bit more of that, as you said. If we see other states then try to follow and introduce similar laws, I wonder what path that's going to go down. And this kind of dispute could actually end up being quite significant, really, in terms of what happens in the rest of the country.
Indeed. And I think we're going to see that continued split of America. I mean, we're polarized in this country, but the polarized times 1,000 across the pond. So yeah, again, like I said in the previous piece, I think we're going to be talking a bit more about this. I think it's probably not finished.
Yep.
So yeah, so moving on slightly, obviously this is being recorded on the 12th of September, so obviously a day late, but yesterday was the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. Declan, do you remember where you were? 2001?
Yeah, I do. I was just about old enough. I was on holiday actually. I was a lot younger child. I can't remember exactly how old, but I remember seeing it on television. Everyone just stopped what they were doing. I'm sure many people have similar memories, and everyone was fixated. It's one of those. I feel like every year that goes by, I learn more about it because it's obviously extensively covered. There's a Netflix documentary about it at the moment, which is out, which I've been watching and is really very good. But just the sadness of it, the stories of the people who were affected, the kind of the people, the altruistic people who stayed behind to make sure others were out, and then ended up unfortunately losing their own life in the attacks. Particularly people in the South Tower, which was hit second. And obviously a lot of that backstory is about the conflicts in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and obviously that's something very significant which has obviously dominated the headlines recently as well. A lot of people are kind of wondering, well, what was the point of all that? And to prevent attacks like that happening when we leave the Taliban in charge 20 years later in the same place. So it's kind of a sad milestone, I think, this year in particular. I think it's hitting home quite hard for a lot of Americans and people around the world.
Well, it's the first anniversary of 9/11 where America hasn't been at war as a direct result of 9/11. Yeah, I'm a little bit older than you. I was in 10th grade. It was in year 10, and I was in Australia at the time. And we didn't find out until the next morning. We woke up and everything had happened sort of 6 hours prior. But I remember I had a science exam that morning, so it was an interesting exam. But yeah, it was a bit of a surreal feeling. Yeah, and I mean, like I said, you said that, we obviously know a lot about it. There was a really poignant picture that was released by Joe Biden of him, and also President Obama and President Clinton, with the respective first ladies all paying their respects. And I think President Bush was in Pennsylvania giving an address in Shanksville. Conversely, I think President Trump was commentating a boxing match, doing something. Yeah, so it just shows the absolutely, if there's going to be one day in the year in America where they could perhaps not think about party political issues and, just come together for the greater good and just, mourn the dead and, try to make something good of a terrible situation, it would be September the 11th. But yeah, there we are. So
yeah, it's interesting just watching that again, just watching some of the footage about it. And I was watching about when they realized it was a hijacking, when people on the plane were literally calling the airline's emergency number, American Airlines emergency number, to report that it was being hijacking. Just kind of how slow it all was. I mean, I know it was 20 years ago, but it really does feel like a different era in terms of how slow the kind of authorities were to react to it. You think about now how in Britain, the United States, a lot of countries have fighter jets ready to be scrambled within a moment's notice, ready to attack a plane, to defend something. And it was just interesting how slow it kind of unraveled over there. So even though the plane had quite clearly cut off communication, quite clearly people had phoned and reported it, it still had time. I think it was somewhere over Virginia, wasn't it, when it turned around and went all the way back. And that's a fair distance. Do you know what I mean, to get there? And you think there probably would have been time maybe to
intercept it or something.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's terrible, and it's think that's the decision. Do you shoot down a plane in the middle of nowhere, or do you let it go into New York? And it's a terrible decision to make, but to have that decision to make is an opportunity at least to prevent it. Whereas it just seemed to be so slowly unraveling.
It would have been I think it would have been a very different day had it happened 20 years later, given social media didn't exist in 2001. So when as we all know, when a big story breaks, and when the biggest story of the century breaks, I mean, Twitter and etc. is absolutely awash with people saying all sorts of things, from claiming responsibility all the way through to giving sympathy, all the way to trying to give your hot take on it, that kind of thing. So I wonder if that would have had an impact on the response, whether it would have made it quicker, or indeed it could have made things worse. I think it probably could have added certainly to the confusion. And you watch a lot of these documentaries, and it really does hit home how confused and how truly unprepared America was. So yeah, and I think it's really important that we stay connected to that, and especially now that there are people who are at university who weren't born in 2001. We say we were children, and I was in high school and you were a bit younger than that, but there were people who were card carrying adults who were babies or even less. There were people who could have gone to Afghanistan in the later stages of that campaign, who weren't born when the initial attack happened. And yeah, it's interesting to not have that sort of direct link.
Yeah, and it's kind of just final point in this, but it's also interesting about how are we going to see something like this again now in the future? Because I think that possibility now has to be considered with the fact that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan, and it could once again become a breeding ground for terrorism. We know that it's groups like the Islamic State, IS, while they've largely been defeated, are still around and still doing things. So it's kind of a worrying thing now, especially I think for people living in the West who are involved in travel and things like that. I think many people will be slightly nervous about that, because and also that you think about the kind of the stereotypes and the kind of the tension between different ethnic groups as well in Europe, that could be something again which comes into it and which starts to boil over a little bit. So yeah, I think there's going to be a little bit of uncertainty in the future about hopefully something like this won't happen again, but there's always possibility of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. I think the type of attack is obviously going to not be the same. I mean, you're not going to successfully use airplanes as missiles in the same way that they did 20 years ago. But yeah, you're totally right, and that in some ways plays into the uncertainty even more. What form is this attack going to take? So yeah, I think the chances of it are certainly higher than they were before the US pulled out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so. So finally, moving on slightly, the final thing that I want to talk about is something that completely moving on, but is that happened today. Sajid Javid made an announcement to say that the UK government will no longer be pursuing vaccine passports in the UK, having previously said that they were in support of them for things like large events and crowds, and also Scotland have said that they will be using vaccine passports. So what do you make of that decision?
Yeah, controversial decision to use vaccine passports. I understood why they wanted to use them for large events, and particularly for young people at things like nightclubs, and people going to, for example, sports stadiums. I do understand why they want to do that. I've been to a big sports stadium without vaccine passports, and it worked fine. If I had to take a guess, I'd say the vast majority of people there probably have got their vaccine just because of the high uptake that we've had in this country. I never felt particularly concerned about, getting COVID. I've taken my vaccines myself. I've had two. I'm double vaccinated. It just didn't come into it for me. So I was a little bit skeptical of vaccine passports. While I can see that the benefit of them and that kind of added security, I think it's probably, at this stage, it's probably wiser just to let people take personal responsibility, and by that I mean to take basic measures to make sure they're safe. So when you're indoors, like I did when I went to a football stadium, we wore a mask, and then when we got outside, sat on our seat, we took it off because we were in an open air. I made sure I did one of those lateral flow tests before we went, just to double check. So I think that there's basic things you can do.
Okay. I've got some right here. Here we go.
Yeah, the NHS free ones, right? You can get them for free. I know not everyone will do that, and that's a shame. But I just think what people should do is just take basic responsibility, basic precautions. Clean your hands when you go home, use the hand sanitizer while you're there. And I don't think passport vaccines will be a necessity. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do agree with you, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it's interesting you say that people can be relied upon to make these choices. I mean, Declan, you're a sensible guy. You're going to a football stadium and wearing your mask indoors and taking them off when you're outdoors and cleaning your hands and staying apart from people. That's great. But I do fear that you're probably perhaps smarter than your average person, and I do fear that there will be a number of people who won't do that. Yeah. That being said, I think vaccine passports are perhaps a tool that could be used if vaccine uptake wasn't as high as it needed to be. Obviously, we're seeing a rise in cases, but as of yet, that hasn't translated into an equal rise in deaths compared with in the first and second lockdowns when we weren't as widely vaccinated. Yeah. And if you look at somewhere like France, I think I couldn't tell you the exact percentages, but the president of France said he made an announcement and said, right, as of I think it was the 1st of August. Anybody who's unvaccinated will no longer be welcome in restaurants, cafes, art galleries, blah, blah, blah. And if you look at the graph of people getting vaccinated, it was kind of, straight all of a sudden. Yeah. So it did have the desired effect to kind of motivate and incentivize people to get vaccinated. I mean, we've hit 80% double jabbed across the UK, well, for adults anyway, and that's great. Obviously, that whether or not we should be vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds, I think personally we should be, but that's a different argument. But yeah, and I think also from a government perspective, it's just one less thing that they have to worry about administering. Yeah. This government is not great at organising things quickly. There's been several bungles when it comes to certain rollouts of certain things. If you look at the Test and Trace app, that and a number of myriad of other things, with the notable exception of the vaccine rollout, but that was handled by the NHS. So I just wonder whether the government have said, right, we want to move on from COVID, and we want to talk about other priorities. So let's just drop that. But yeah, I've not seen any polling, but it'd be interesting to see how many people agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you or what your experience has been, but when I've spoke to people about it, I've met very few people who've been in favour of it. And that's people on all kinds of the political spectrum. I just haven't found many, because at the end of the day, it's just a hindrance for people. And I know it's basic, but what if your phone battery dies that day when you're going to some event? What if your little card? What if you lose your card? If you don't have a smartphone for older people? And it's just going to be another pain for people. We've got enough trouble with doing things like travel with COVID. It's a nightmare to research. It's a nightmare to do all that. Doing that again, going here to go to an event, to go to a club. I just think some people just wouldn't bother, and that's bad for business. That's bad for the economy. We need people now to be going out. We need people to be meeting up and going to restaurants, the pubs, football matches, whatever it is. So I haven't found many people in support of it. It seemed like a lot of work on government. I think it's a sensible thing to scrap it. Interesting that it's still going to happen in Scotland. It will be really interesting to follow that and see how that plays out, really. I mean, how do you think it's going to go there?
Well, if you look at the moves of Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government, throughout the pandemic, if the UK government say, right, we're gonna raise things this much, Scotland have said, right, we're gonna do it this much, just a little bit, and if the UK say, well, we're going to go here, they just go there, So it doesn't surprise me that they've said it. But then again, Scotland is a much smaller place relative to the whole UK in terms of population. So in terms of administering these sorts of things, it's perhaps not as difficult. And they've had a higher, they've had more cases. I know that's because schools have gone back. They go back a month earlier in Scotland than they do in England. But again, it'll also be interesting to see how long this sort of thing lasts for. Is this an indefinite thing? How will that stay administered? And again, I think I do agree that it's perhaps not necessary, because it's a bit of a slippery slope, isn't it? You've got, ultimately we are talking about people's civil liberties. We let people smoke cigarettes, we let people gamble, we let people drink alcohol, and if somebody doesn't want to, and obviously taking into account the risks. So we erode, if you erode these civil liberties one by one, it'd be interesting to see where we stop.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think that's something that's been very much on people's minds, isn't it? Because I think what you often find when you erode these civil liberties, it's really hard to go back. We were talking about 9/11, and I don't remember much about plane travel before then, but my parents do, and some of my family members do. And one of the things that they always talk about is how you could travel, with things like liquids and things so quite easily before then. Now, obviously they introduced a temporary ban on things like that during 9/11 to after 9/11 to stop, more events happening, and we've never really gone back. It's one of those things that has always stayed there. Obviously, of course, it makes it safer, but the risk of terrorism is always going to be there. So, I think when you introduce things like vaccine passports now for COVID, then it does bear the question, well, do we have it for other things? Do we make people wear some kind of special pass to show they have another kind of, disability or condition, or, any kind of, there's so many things that you could then go into and push that further. And I just think it's very unlikely we go back from that. So, yeah, definitely the right decision.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just one other point to make is I think if they're not, it does surprise me. Well, it surprises me some ways and doesn't surprise me at all in others, but that they're not going to do this, but equally they're not mandating any other safety precautions. It'd be much easier to say, right, indoors in these high volume settings, football matches and stuff, you must wear a mask. That's something that could be quite easily mandated by the government for a while. because you're not then taking away people's civil liberties, and then you are keeping everybody relatively safe. It's just that is something that did surprise me. But like you say, it's a personal choice thing, and we just need to think the best of people, and that, you know, give them the benefit of the doubt, and that they're going to obviously keep everybody safe as possible. And it's an interesting point you make about pre 9/11 travel. Like I said, I'm a little bit older than you, and I grew up in New Zealand, obviously a hotbed of terrorist activity for many years. It's not, by the way, for anybody who's out there and I remember going on airplanes as a young child quite a lot with absolutely no security whatsoever. Yeah. You turn up to the airport, put your bag on the carousel, you wait for your boarding call, and you get on the plane. So yeah, it's but like I said, it's not the case anymore. Right, so I think after all that, I think that's all we've got time for this week. So yeah, thanks very much for coming on, Declan. And yeah, stay tuned for us. We'll be back next week to talk about the news of the week. I'm sure it won't be a slow news week. It never tends to be. We never tend to struggle to get subjects on this podcast. So until then, join us next time. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.